From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. Repression of demonstrations in Chile continued into the night in the capital, Santiago. Peaceful protesters who had gathered at Dignity Square, Plaza Italia, were driven out by police launching tear gas. Massive mobilizations calling for the dismantling of the neoliberal state have entered their sixth week. The protesters also demand the resignation of President Sebastian Piñera and a new constituent assembly to create a new constitution for the country. At least 2,808 people have been hospitalized by police repression. Later, citizens held a vigil for those killed during the demonstrations. Officials' figures say that at least 24 people have died so far. And the Santa Maria Clinic confirmed that 21-year-old student Gustavo Gatica Villarroel has been blinded by a projectile fired by police on November 8th. The number of eye injuries is at least 232, a disproportionately high figure by international standards, sparking serious concerns of deliberate malpractice on the part of security forces. Meanwhile, protesters in Spain have condemned the Chilean government as murderers ahead of the COP25 climate summit. The conference was scheduled to be hosted in Chile, but the event was moved to Madrid. Chilean President Sebastian Piñera was supposed to be in attendance, but hasn't traveled with his country's delegation.
We're here to say that we're not in favour of Spain welcoming the Chilean government and that Chile remains the official host of the COP conference, because this means they're still legitimising a murderous government, a government that has declared war on its people. What the people have done is nothing more than demonstrate for historic causes that have been ongoing for more than 30 years. It's not about 30 cents, it's about 30 years. The people have been protesting for more than a month, and the only response from the government has been repression. We're here with our hands stained with blood, just like the Chilean government today.
A general strike was called by Chile's trade unions on Monday and Tuesday. They say the stoppages will continue until the government decides to listen.
After more than 5 weeks of protests against neoliberal policies in Chile, trade unions and social movements called on the population to join another general strike on the 26th of November.
We are calling on everyone in both the public and private sectors to paralyze the country. This Tuesday, on Monday we had a partial strike, and Tuesday is the big nationwide stoppage, and we will continue to mobilize. We have been pro-existing for a month, and the government has understood nothing. So the trade union movement will keep calling strikes if this government doesn't finally address the demands of the people.
The organizers say the strike is being fueled by the impunity enjoyed by those responsible for the repeated human rights violations by the security forces against the Chilean people in the streets. They demand that the government of Sebastian Piñera accept political responsibility for these abuses.
The government must take responsibility for the flagrant abuses of human rights that have occurred, not just in recent days, but since the first day of the uprising. So we say very emphatically that there must be no impunity. We demand the truth and justice and compensation for the relatives and victims of these human rights abuses.
Workers, students and other movements insist the protests won't stop until there are new social and economic policies for the health service, education, pensions and labor rights. Most social movements agree that the only way to really change the country is through a constituent assembly with the broadest possible participation of the people in order to build a country that is genuinely inclusive.
We have a president who is not governing the country, so Piñera must resign. And we must move towards building a new country through this new constituent assembly elected by the people.
The unions and social movements have called for stoppages in the ports and public services, as well as marches across the country. A repetition of the general strike on November the 12th, which brought 90% of workers in the public sector and 60% in the private sector.
The persecution of political leaders, part of the movement towards a socialism party, continues despite an agreement for new elections in Bolivia. Police, acting in conjunction with the de facto government installed after the right-wing coup to depose President Evo Morales, arrested Daisy Choque, a former candidate for the MAS party. She was detained while giving an interview at her home. Her lawyer says she is a political prisoner. And 36 days after the Bolivian elections were held, the OAS has publicly confirmed it still has no final report of their audit. This despite pushing for governmental change and supporting the coup staged after Evo Morales won the vote. Our correspondent in La Paz, Feli Morales, has the latest.
La situación en general de Bolivia ya es de normalidad total.
The situation in Bolivia is more or less normal now. Last night, what's being considered the final agreement was signed between social sectors and the current government. The Bolivian Workers' Union, the Campesino Confederation, the Women's Campesino Bertolina Sisa organization, and others, which make up, according to President Evo Morales, his social cabinet, with which he met every month. Last night, the pacification of the country agreement was signed, bringing an end to all ongoing mobilizations. The previous day, an agreement was signed in Cochabamba between coca growers and other organizations, with the authorities and the department. The deal included the lifting of roadblocks and the normalization of all activities. Yesterday, the first member of the new Supreme Electoral Court was chosen, corresponding to the delegate for the executive. Salvador Romero, who was president of the court between 2004 and 2008, he's going to be the government's representative. Within the coming 18 days, the legislative will assign the remaining 6 places. Once they are assigned, election must be called within 24 hours. Something key to this is that a time frame of between 90 and 120 days has been cited for elections, but Salvador Romero, the executive's delegate, has said that this is impossible. Now he's saying that a more likely time is the middle of April.
Freddy Morales from Bolivia. That was him. And after the break, we hear from Dominican PM Roosevelt Skerrit in an exclusive interview with Telesur as his country prepares to go to the polls. Stay with us.
The life is full of moments. Moments of fight. Moments of hope. Moments that transcend. Moments that you can live in. Telesur documentaries. Sundays. Only on Telesur.
Welcome back. The Prime Minister of Dominica, Roosevelt Skerrit, says the opposition, backed from abroad, is trying to stop elections from taking place on December 6. He was speaking in an exclusive interview with Telesur's Marilyn Garcia.
Well, you know, we are having general elections in our country on December 6. And there are attempts to derail or to prevent this from happening. And the opposition is seeking to create a situation in the country that would give one the impression that the country is not stable, that there are riots, and there are serious conflicts taking place in the country. And therefore, it would appear to the outside world that the country is ungovernable. And therefore, that situation would not allow for the holding of elections in our country. Now, the opposition is saying that the reason why they're taking those actions is because there have been no electoral reform in our country. Now, this government, which I have had the honor to lead, has done all what is required to ensure that there is the electoral reform that's required. But the legislation which was required to be passed in the parliament to allow for the reform to be completely effective was blocked by the opposition. So on one hand, they say they support electoral reform, but on the other hand, they are not prepared to support the actions which are required to get the electoral reform in place.
Skerrit also accused the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, of promoting the campaign against his government. He said that was for retaliation for Dominica consistently voting against intervention in the region.
We believe that the Secretary General of the OAS is one such person who has had an issue with Dominica's position at the OAS, you know, and you have seen his tweets, and this is not, the Secretary General of the OAS is supposed to be an independent person, an apolitical person, who is a representative of all of the nations of the OAS. But it is clear by his actions, by his utterances, by his tweets, by his statements, that he has a bias in Dominica, and that bias is against my government. I think he has a program or a strategy of regime change in the OAS, and they are targeting certain member states. Dominica is one such country which they're targeting, and my government is one such government that they're targeting. So it is not about whether there's going to be free and fair elections in Dominica. It is not about the electoral process. They have waited for this opportunity to implement the strategy. So it is something that has been in the making for 3-4 years, and now is the opportunity to have it implemented. There are entities and interests that are using elections, and so they make a pronouncement that these elections were not free and fair, and therefore this government has to be set aside, and they will install who they want. And you see it in the region. There were attempts in Venezuela to do the same. They did it, you know. So it is the same script.
Antigua and Barbuda's Prime Minister Gaston Brown is hitting back at U.S. officials whom he criticized for involving themselves in his country's internal affairs. This after U.S. Senator Dick Durbin chastised Brown for taking a $15.8 million loan from the Alba Bank to inject into the cash-strapped regional airline Liat.
I don't know why they have to intervene into our domestic affairs. We do not get into their affairs. We do not comment on their affairs. We're an independent state, and even though we are small, they ought to extend some level of respect to us in our decisions. We understand that we cannot utilize the U.S. system to move money emanating out of Venezuela, and we will never violate, because at the end of the day, we take U.S. policies very seriously, even though we may not necessarily agree with their sanctions. Where their sanctions, we do not violate. So the $15 million that we will be getting from the Alba Bank, it is actually EC money that is already in our jurisdiction, even though denominated in US dollars. It's EC dollars that we will utilize to invest in Liat. So we will not be utilizing the US banking system.
Citizen has held a vigil for 18-year-old Dylan Cruz, the latest fatality of violent police repression in Colombia. Students from the University of Cartagena laid flowers, candles and posters outside the Piedra de Bolívar campus and the historic center. Cruz died due to his injuries after he was hurt by police in Bogotá during demonstrations over the weekend. The students are now demanding an investigation into his death. Meanwhile, the National Strike Committee and the Workers' Central Union reissued the call for protests to continue against the neoliberal policies proposed by the government. They are also insisting on the dismantling of the riot police. Teachers, leaders, and other trade unionists are calling for another nationwide strike after meeting with President Iván Duque. They said the government was still not listening to their demands.
Tomorrow, teachers, students, people from rural areas, indigenous people, social movements, popular movements, the Colombian people, we will be there, and we hope that the President of the Republic will give us a prompt response if he wants a solution.
Our correspondent Enar Tobar has more from Bogotá.
We are here on the streets of Bogotá, where there are numerous marches, vigils, and pot-banning demonstrations taking place all over the city. In this street, you can see behind me many students who are protesting against the murder of Dylan Cruz, the 18-year-old protester who was seriously wounded by the riot police on Saturday. And yesterday, the hospital announced that he had died of his injuries. Also in the afternoon and evening, several pot-banging protests are being held. The organizing committee of the national strike met with President Iván Duque earlier in the day and presented their list of demands. But they didn't accept President Duque's attempt to incorporate them into what he is calling a grand national dialogue. They said that wasn't appropriate because their strike has specific demands around pensions, labor rights, and so forth, which need to be addressed directly and not as a part of a broader meeting. They also want to talk about the human rights abuses that have been committed by the security forces against demonstrators in the streets in recent days.
Hernán Tobar from Colombia. Mexico is seeking a meeting with United States officials to discuss the announcement made by President Donald Trump about designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations. Mexico's foreign minister said it would seek a high-level meeting to discuss how to reduce the illegal flow of arms and money from the United States to criminals in Mexico. Trump said this month he will help Mexico wage war on the drug cartels and wipe them off the face of the earth. Human rights activists denounced the so-called war on drugs promoted by the U.S. as a failed foreign policy, highlighting that it is behind the killings and disappearances of thousands, as well as conducive to violence in Mexico. Brazil's economy minister has come under fire for saying the government might bring back dictatorship laws if groups promote protests, such as those in Chile. Minister Paulo Guedes told reporters not to be surprised if someone called for an AI-5, a measure decreed by the military dictatorship to close Congress and suppress dissent. This comes after the former president Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva said he will unite the left in the country after being freed and win the next elections. Heads of both chambers of Congress and several political figures repudiated the announcement as a threat to democracy. Guedes later took back his comments and said the return of the decree would not happen. In other news, dozens of Peruvian protesters clashed with police on Monday evening following the Constitutional Court's decision to release opposition leader Keiko Fujimori. Fujimori has been held in pretrial detention since October last year, pending a corruption case linked to Brazilian construction giant Odebrecht. The court accepted an habeas corpus request and announced that the ruling cannot be appealed. Fujimori is expected to be released later this week after complying with legal formalities.
In spite of the fact that much more evidence has emerged, including the statement about illegal contributions to Keiko Fujimori, who didn't even declare her campaign to the ONPE, the Constitutional Court released her.
Keiko Fujimori, a person who is known to be involved in a massive corruption case in which she has received money from banks from mining, is released.
Still to come, citizens in the Democratic Republic of Congo grow frustrated with UN peacekeeping efforts. Don't go away.
Our actions have an impact on the environment. It's our responsibility to change for the sake of our planet. Let's be part of this transition. Watch, preserve, and protect your Green Zone. Wednesdays, only on Telesur.
Thank you for joining us again. 13 French soldiers died in Mali's northern region after a helicopter collision during an operation against a militant group. The accident occurred on Monday evening while the soldiers were engaging fighters who staged a series of deadly attacks in recent weeks. An inquiry has been opened into the case of the mid-air collision. Mali's President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta expressed his sympathies to France and said his country was grateful for the work of the soldiers.
Mali is a grateful country. Mali knows the cost for that country today for sending her children to the Sahel to defend its causes, the causes of peace, anti-terrorism, and the promotion of development and democracy. These are all the things that these young people came here to defend. Their deaths will never leave us. More than that, our empathy with France and the families of these young disappeared is total.
Tanzania's ruling party has won over 99% of seats in local elections that were boycotted by the opposition. Official results from the Sunday ballot show the Chama Cha Mapinduzi party scoring more than 330,000 local leadership positions, which are highly influential and could set the tone for the 2020 general elections. Chadema, the main opposition party, said earlier this month it would not take part in the vote because of alleged government manipulation and mass disqualification of its candidates. 5 other smaller parties also joined the boycott. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, 2 people have been killed after protesters targeted United Nations facilities for the second day. Residents angered by the recent killings of civilians stormed UN peacekeeping camps for the second time. They accused them of failing to stop deadly attacks by rebels. So far, the World Health Organization has moved almost 50 staff out of Beni as insecurity grows in the region.
The security situation in Beni has definitely worsened overnight or throughout the last days. What we see is community violence against the security situation. That's very important for us because it's not a violence directed against the Ebola response and it's not a violence directed against WHO. Rollback Malaria Partnership. While 49 were relocated, 71 remain on the spot to this point to assure as good as possible the best or at least the minimum support to the Ebola response.
Hundreds of Palestinians have clashed with Israeli forces across the West Bank as they protested against the U.S. policy shift on Israeli settlements. During their so-called Day of Rage, Palestinians hurled stones at Israeli soldiers. They fired tear gas and stun grenades to disperse the crowd. Last week, the Trump administration announced it was abandoning its 4-decade-old position that Israeli settlements in the West Bank were inconsistent with international law. By doing so, the U.S. effectively backed Israel's right to build settlements in the occupied West Bank.
We are here to say that this decision makes the American administration participant with Israel in violating international law. Israeli settlements are illegal by international law, by the decision of the International Court of Justice. And we are here to declare that we will struggle for our rights, for our freedom, to end occupation and to bring down the system of apartheid that Israel has created all over Palestine.
Hundreds of people in London gathered for a solidarity conference on Latin America with high-profile speakers from the region. Pablo Navarrete reports.
On Saturday in London, hundreds attended the Latin America 2019 conference, where discussions centred on the current political and social realities in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the threat many countries in the region face from reactionary forces, both internally and from the United States government under Donald Trump.
I think it's really important for solidarity delegations to go to the regions, to visit these countries. And the fact is that we can learn very much from being in the region. I mean, the amount of things that we could learn from speaking to the social movement in Bolivia about how the indigenous population came to be treated under Morales and what is happening now is astonishing.
The event saw a special video message by the renowned US academic and activist Noam Chomsky, who spoke about the current wave of uprisings against neoliberal governments in countries such as Chile. And a letter by the former president of Brazil, Lula, was read out in which he thanked the British and International Union movement and solidarity organisations for supporting the Lula Livre campaign to free him. The conference is the biggest solidarity event of its kind in Europe, and one of the event's main supporters is the TUC, the Federation of English and Welsh Trade Unions, that represents more than 5.5 million workers.
So Latin America is an area that's been of particular interest to the TUC for many years. At the moment, Colombia and Brazil are two of the priority countries for our international solidarity. We see the increasing repression in Brazil under Bolsonaro as part of this international threat of the far right that is growing. And Colombia continues to be the most dangerous place in the world for trade unionists, but we are supporting efforts to implement the peace agreement. And we're proud to be involved in supporting this Latin America conference.
With an election in the UK on the 12th of December that could see a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government with a very different relationship between the UK and Latin America, discussions on the need for solidarity with progressive forces in Latin America seem more relevant than ever. Pablo Navarrete, Telesur, London.
And with that report, we end our news brief. But you can find all of our stories by checking our website at telesurenglish.net. And be sure to join us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.